All right, a very good evening and good afternoon and good morning to all of us joining from Sri Lanka and around the world. Welcome to the fifth episode of the first season of This, That, and the Other. My name is Varun Chandramohan, your host for today. And seated somewhere in this universe is a trainer at Luminary Learning Solutions, an activist, a digital strategist, a designer, and the TEDx Colombo organizer, who also happens to be my co-host for the day. Safra Anwar is here with us today. Hello, Safra. Welcome to the show. So this, that, and the other is a series that tackles some of the biggest, most controversial challenges HR and senior managers face within an organization. So far we've covered affairs at work, we've covered side hustles, we've covered what does it take to be successful in business, whether it's strategy or luck. And last week we covered equality and diversity, and are we there yet? So this week we are going to be talking about sustainability, myth or reality. And to do that, it's time to introduce our guest. First up, he is the Executive Vice President at Epic Group and a sustainability specialist with a grounding on climate science, communications, corporate strategy, and change. Dr. Vidura Ralapanave is here with us today. Good afternoon, Dr.
Good
Vidura.
afternoon.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. And finally, he's a consultant for sustainable innovation and the author of the world's first direct carbon negative product concept with over 10,000 hours of structured research on climate change and mitigation. Chaminda Serasinghe is here with us today. Hello, Chaminda.
Hi, thank you. Nice being here.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the show. All right, gentlemen, let's dive straight in. So globally speaking, from a corporate perspective, from an organization's perspective rather, how would you define what sustainability is? What is it? Why should we care about it?
Whom are you asking the question from? Vidura or me?
Go ahead, Chaminda.
Yeah, so Chaminda, we'll
Okay.
start with you.
Okay,
And then
I'll let Vidura follow me on the corporate aspect.
Sure.
I am a little out of the corporate aspect because when it comes to sustainability, I think it has to be the human aspect, right? Because the corporates won't survive anyway. So in I think the biggest issue I think is we are adding about 150 souls every day. 150,000, I'm sorry, 150,000 souls every day. So that's our population growth. So unfortunately, this is not talked about. We are talking the technical science of it. We are talking about, various kinds of stuff. But the mouths we feed is increasing by 150,000. That is netting the deaths, right? Averages and deaths. So if you go to a site called Worldometers, you'll see, a fairly accurate figure coming out.
Okay.
So we have a limited resource, right?
Yeah.
We have unlimited population growth.
Right. Yeah.
So between the two, we have a sustainability issue. So that's how I see as sustainability. And we are struggling, to bring in innovations and all that to feed these mouths more and more and more and more, right? So it may be a point that we have not really explored A to Z of the reverse resources, but exploitation is one aspect we'll have to look at. The other two is knowledge in innovation to manage the resources in the ratios that were, confirmed by nature. So if you look at the world, say if you go to the International Space Station and look at the world, the little globe, the only thing unsustainable to me is a rocket going out or a satellite. Because those things we cannot get back, our minerals, right? Thanks to Elon Musk, at least the tank we are bringing it back, the fuel. So other than that, whatever remains in the planet remains in the planet. We are just messing around with the ratios, right? So we have a increasing population growth. We are not managing the resources to the best possible ratios that the nature predetermined. So that is basically my angle of sustainability and the sustainability issue that we are facing.
All right, that's an interesting take. So, Vidura, do you have another side to that, or anything to add?
Sure. So let me ground it in a slightly different point of view. We talk about sustainability both in the corporate and uncorporate world in a way that recognizes the larger systemic nature of the world that we live in. And what I mean by that is when we look at the environmental side, which Chaminda actually spoke about, we ask what are the system boundaries, what is the system that what is the ecological system on which our human civilization and the corporations that we talk about are actually built on. The traditional way that organizations think about, they put the financial and economic survival of an organization as at the forefront of our conversations, forgetting that it's built on social structures and the social structures are sustained by ecological structures. So when we speak about sustainability, it is an attempt to bring or broaden that discourse to bring the human system, the social systems and the ecological systems into our conversation and ask questions like, how are these systems nurtured within the way we run our organization? Now, this is something also interesting because what's going on is that a lot of our work is structured around, we tend to look at the world from a very anthropocentric point of view, from a human-centered point of view, right? But we need to step out and think about the world as something much more than human. We call this the more than human world in some literature. And the idea is that how we think about nature is, because of the way we are educated, is from a human utility point of view. Right. From a human exploitation point of view, which is something that Chaminda also touched on. But we need to think about nature in a bit more complex point of view, because all of the connections and the systems that support life is not yet understood by scientists or by average people like you and me, right? And nature is much more bigger, much more complex, much more interdependent than what we actually see. So the idea on corporate sustainability is actually to bring those elements as much as possible into our thinking patterns, into our decision making, so that we not only take from nature, we not only take from society, but we also return, but we don't also damage it into an irreversible state. So that's the wider agenda of corporate sustainability, in my opinion. Now, the topic that you mentioned, is it myth or reality? The ideal, is you may even call it a utopian ideal that we are striving for, and a lot of the time the corporations themselves have not been either good custodians or nor have they quite a lot of the time put a coherent and relevant strategy towards corporate sustainability, and that remains to be a problem. And unless, and I think one of the challenges that we face as we enter into years of more and more ecological destruction is that how do we rethink the way we approach our business? How do we rethink the way we think about nature? How do we rethink that we think about society? And fundamentally ask a question, how should our organizations and our businesses be structured in a world where sustainability becomes center stage?
That's pretty interesting. So let me put both our guests on the spot and ask, if you were to take a ballpark if you were to give us a number out of all the organizations out there who are saying they're going green and they're sustainable, or rather they're investing in sustainability and so on, which percentage of the organizations are following it what would the number be? From your experience, based on what you've seen, where do you think that number would be? Like somebody who's following it to the dot as per the rule book. Any guesses? This is open to both panels.
Okay, so let me look at it in two different ways. One is there are very few organizations who actually talk about sustainability. Okay, I know everybody talks, but there's very few organizations who actually talk about it. If you look at all the organizations in the world, or even in Sri Lanka, I don't think even 1% is actually talking about sustainability to start with.
Right.
I might put something around 1% of those who might be doing something significant. I mean, it's like quite a lot of other things, because we have to remember that this has been spoken about, but it's been seriously looked into, apart from very few niche outlier organizations in mainstream organizational science. This is quite new.
Right.
This is on one side, and on the second side, the kind of ecological destruction, if I were to just look at the environmental point of view, that we are seeing, the catastrophic type of a destruction that we are seeing in the last 10 to 15 years, and the science behind it is also fairly new in terms of its mass acceptance. It doesn't mean that the science was not known. Science was known from, probably, I mean, science behind climate change is probably 100 years old, right? But it's probably 30 years that we are seriously talking about it, and maybe last 5 years that people realize that this is something urgent to really respond to. So there is a evolution of this process. But I still think that both as organizations and as individuals, there's a huge space for us to act, and that we haven't even scratching the surface of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can only vouch for that. It's not of anybody's fault per se. So if you put another perspective into it, like there is 7.8 billion people, what percentage know sustainability?
Right.
Yeah. So that's the one that stems into corporate structures, culture, societies, the whole works. So the fact of the matter is, actually, I call it the 3 C's, right?
Okay.
Comfort, convenience, cost. Right. See, we are having this discussion, right? Is any one of us bothered whether the power coming into your laptop is coming from a solar panel or from a sustainable source? Maybe we are bothered in terms of our the work that we do and research and all that. But the question is, the fact is that we are having this conveniently, comfortably, right? And I just popped into my office, so I have put the AC also on. So so that's the fact. The fact is, at what percentage have we cracked comfort, convenience, and cost is actually the way I see it. The moment you crack comfort, convenience, and cost, percentages can go viral, because all of us work towards profitability, convenience, and at the end of the day, comforts in our lives. Right. So whatever you push, saying 5% of sustainability, or next year we are going to do 15% of sustainability, that does not work if you are comfortable with a cost-effective resource, isn't it?
Interesting.
So what happens is, the entrepreneur, the administrator, when I say administrator, is the governments, the regulators, the whole works, and the consumer alike has to come into this. And the scientists and the engineers and the innovators and all that should crack the 3 C's of mine, right? At the end of the day, it's profitability. So once that is done, and I think there is a lot of research. So the little work that I do a little bit on the Europe side, I do a little bit on the US side, and then predominantly in the Japan side. So because of that, I have got a nice dashboard, in front of me as to see what's working. And I would say Europe is, in my perspective, Europe is trying hard. And I'm working, consulting to a, venture capital firm that that finances these projects. And then the stuff that comes out, even to the extent of hydrogen plasma and all that, is pretty amazing. So there's a good percentage who is trying out to crack the 3 C's, make it profitable, and once that is done, the takeoff is very fast. So right now we are in an incubatory period, bringing in the sustainability mindset, and I think it's all good, but I just can't put a number to it.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. How serious are companies? Like now you said that Europe is on the forefront, and that's an interesting point that you brought up, because even last week during our gender equality discussion, also some of the best practices and some of the countries that were heading or who were leaps ahead of progress in that sphere was also from Europe, and in this case particularly the Scandinavian countries, and it's an interesting observation, or rather interesting point that you brought up. So in that sense, how serious are like coming back to Sri Lanka, like how serious are companies about their sustainability promises or their sustainability initiatives?
See, you're asking me, right? Or Vidura?
Yes.
Chamin, go ahead, Chamin. I'll add on.
So from the European.
Let's keep Asia out for a little while. Asia is still in the consumer mode and not in the innovator mode per se. But let's say then I drive a little i3 electric vehicle coming up and down, right? Now that has profitability. With 1 unit of electricity, I'm getting about 7 kilometers of run. So the companies who have seen the profitability in the hydrogen era, now we are talking about carbon nanotube based batteries, whole works, it is pretty serious, because it is disruptive technologies that are taken off with the raw material input that are in abundance, like silicon, like hydrogen, like carbon, right? So earlier we were focused on copper, tin, and all that kind of stuff, and then lithium ion and all that kind of stuff for batteries and all those things. So knowledge is fantastic. Thanks to the internet, we share knowledge and a lot of that. So there's an exponential growth in I think human knowledge. That much I can say. That exponential growth, thankfully, to whatever reason, thanks to COVID, thanks to climate change, thanks to all this kind of stuff that happened, were pushed to look at out of the box solutions, and suddenly we see in this sea of materials like the silicons, the hydrogens, the carbons, which are like next to nothing, it's like free of charge inputs, right? And then solar on the other side are coming into industry, right? So that the realization of a product gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. In that context, that it's pretty serious. It's pretty serious, and people have seen the enormous potential on sustainable mechanisms. However, right at the moment, because of that, there is billions spent on research. So if you really analyze how much of research has gone into these kinds of new disruptive technologies, I kid you not, you would see about 75% of it is kind of a sustainable arrangement, because people have understood that if you play around with the materials of abundance, or the materials that is in abundance, it is easier to put them back into the natural structures than to play around with lithiums and REMs, basically rare earth materials, right? So that's my take. And getting back from Europe again, it's pretty serious. There is billions of dollars that have gone into research and innovation that is more centric towards sustainable innovation.
Sure.
But isn't the context of Europe and like Asia completely different from each other in terms of the fact of the technology? They are more susceptible to actually pulling on these sustainable approaches than here in Sri Lanka. Considering here it's a lot of cost, it's a lot of it's basically above their top line. They really don't want to invest in things like that, because especially now in a time like this, because at the end of the day, from what I know, I've worked in sustainability for 2.5 to 3 years now. The first thing they do when a crisis happens or cost runs over, the first thing they do is look at their top line and go, okay, you need to reduce it by this much, and then they go back to where they started with the natural resources, and they don't really fulfill the requirements of sustainability. Everything goes to scraps. They let go of their suppliers who do sustainable approaches, and then the sustainable companies are hit. So how do we actually, in a real life situation, how do we bring in, like, yes, there's research being done, but how does it actually apply to a country like us?
Well, okay, let me.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So let me jump in on that. So I think what Safra, you spoke about is reality, and if more organizations and if our conversations were also grounded on sustainability, this problem would not have arisen, right? The reason we are having this conversation is because we have built our economies and corporate structures in an outdated paradigm, which basically said we have limitless resources that can be exploited and used. It's only now that it's dawning to us that this is no longer true. While the science has moved and the innovation side is also moving, it's not regular conversation that we are having. So this is one of the reasons that, intuitively we know climate change is really messed up right now. The global heating is in an irreversible state, and there's nothing we can do at this point of time that can reverse the trends that have already unleashed. So we know this, right? But we are not able to act, and that's partly because of an economic model that we have invested in for hundreds of years that does not conceptually understand the value. Just to give a point of view, it's a matter of what we consider as priorities. And I'll give you two examples. In 2008-9, we had a global economic crisis. And all of the governments managed to find trillions of dollars to pump into the banking system to recover their economies out of the challenges that the economy was in, right? So there was never a shortage of funds to tackle a crisis. And we see that happening now in light of COVID-19, because when we've identified crisis, this is the first time that I've seen in my life where economy did not become the priority determinant of any action by a state. And this is happening across the world, right? So some of the, if I were to use a phrase, sacred cows in business and in economic management is no longer valid, because we've seen concrete examples that we have been able to think and reprioritize. Now, if I take, let's not use the word sustainability in too much, but we need to start going into issues, because otherwise we are talking in a very, very generic term, and we are not going to necessarily help people understand this better. But I'll pick something, climate change, which I think Chaminda also does quite a lot of work on.
Right.
I've also done quite a lot of work. And if you put it around that, climate change is currently a crisis that is far greater than what COVID is throwing at us, right? The reason why we don't feel it is that it doesn't come all together as a big crisis, but it's a persistent, which increases year on year. So how do we deal with it? Okay, we have temperature in northern Siberia right now over 40 degrees, and there's forest fires, and this is not normal. The level of melt in both Arctic and Antarctic is completely abnormal, and they are not reversible. As an island nation, if we ground this into Sri Lanka, when there is sea level rise is projected, why is not a priority? So I'll ask a very simple question. If we take a industry like tourism, our tourist industry is built on two foundational value propositions. One is the cultural heritage of Sri Lanka, and the other one is the natural heritage of Sri Lanka. Now, climate change it's threatening and already destroying part of our natural heritage, right? So if we continue business as usual, the question is how long this is going to work, right? So the question is not about what is our priority in a short term. Question is how do we think about our business and what do we prioritize within our business? Because even as we put lockdown measures due to COVID as corporations, we also still do certain amount of work on a strategic point of view, right?
Sure.
And the question I would ask is this: even if I understand what you are doing during COVID, what happened before? When the going was good, when the profits were there, and this is for all the companies, what were you doing before from a sustainability point of view? So the question is not about what we are doing now. Question is what did you do before and what are we going to do after? And coming back to the point that Chaminda mentioned about sustainable innovation, I'm not as optimistic on the innovation on as much as Chaminda. They say, and there's a particular reason to this.
Okay.
The issue is not about innovation. Issue is about adaptation of the innovation.
Sure.
Okay. So for example, we have enough technology in the world now that the whole world can decarbonize their electrical systems within 10 to 15 years. The technology is there. There's nothing missing in technology, and it will actually be cheaper than burning fossil fuels, right? But you don't see that happening. So it's not about lack of innovation. It's about, even when renewable energy is right now, it's cheaper than any other energy source. Even still, the pace of adaptation of that type of technology into our businesses, into our electricity supply in Sri Lanka and in many other parts of the world is very, very lethargic.
Right.
Right. So the question we are asking is, it's comforting to think about a new innovation is going to come and save us, but it's not going to be, because the problem is not about lack of innovation. Problem is that we don't understand the problem, or we don't prioritize the problem to solve the larger issue. Maybe because of Chaminda's 3 C's, maybe because of the larger, the paradigm that we have situated ourselves in. And in a Sri Lankan context, because you asked this, I think our education system has to take quite a large responsibility for our lack of understanding on these areas. And by education system, I talk about schools, universities, business schools all together, because all of them have failed in this purpose. The reason why you have more sort of environmental awareness and movement in Europe is, I would imagine, because the discourse and the education system actually has quite a lot of sustainability elements built into it. But I don't see the same distinction that Chaminda is seeing between US and Europe, and even in Asia, because I've seen innovative companies who are grounded in sustainability across all regions. It's just that in Europe, I think because of the level of the conversation around sustainability is much more matured state, it becomes easier for companies to do more. Whereas in some other locations, maybe in Sri Lanka, maybe in India, maybe in other parts of the world, because of the general understanding is less, it may be difficult. And the second reason is that because European Union is actually driving their EU-wide policy grounded on things like climate change.
Right.
It forces all organizations to act. So you don't have the luxury of not acting.
Okay, interesting. Can I just jump in there and just throw a wrench into this conversation? You mentioned innovation. You mentioned different sort of Europe leading the pack, at least just what Chaman said, and then you did mention that there were other companies that were grounded. What about carbon neutral? Let me bring that in because that has been thrown around, and that word has been thrown around, and then obviously Chamin is an expert, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, and then we'll move to Vidura. Carbon neutral, is it for real? Like is it a myth? Can it be done, or is it a marketing gimmick? Is it or are organizations not doing it quite well? Because if I understand what it is correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm nowhere even close to being an expert or being aware about this topic. So when it comes to carbon neutral, I was told that basically the companies they calculate how much of carbon that each company is emitting, and then they set it off by I think contributing to companies that let's say if it's $1 million worth of carbon, then $1 million worth of trees would be planted. Am I correct, or am I sort of roundabout there, Charminder? Is that what it is?
Good stuff. You're making me a little ticklish also. The good side of it is that this whole carbon neutrality and all these stories is a good understanding from a corporate sense of climate change.
Okay.
Otherwise, no point talking about climate change. Nobody bothers, right? Sure. So this little carbon story actually has brought some corporate sense. There is something measurable, there is something tangible, there is something you can do and monitor the next 6 months and see whether you have done better or not. But whether all these things add up to our issue, I beg to differ. To the simple reason that now going back to Vidura's point, I beg to differ with Vidura about the innovation side of things. So that's why I said I would agree with Vidura in the part of invention, right? What is missing is innovation. Innovation is how it gets to the consumer's hands, right? So invention, yes, I agree with Vidura, all the tech is available. Invention is how cheap, how convenient, and how comfortable it comes to your hand, right? It's like the smartphone, right? The mobile phone was invented, touch screens were invented on games, right? Sure. And computers were invented, but the innovation played in putting all these three together, and then it became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now it's almost viral, right? So sure. In a carbon neutral context, people got lost in this offset story. That is, you have an issue and then you grow trees or something you call the CDM, clean development mechanism, which can offset carbons. And then you trade, right, the credits versus the debits, right? So and then hence they called a carbon neutral or whatever. So but that has no grounded understanding or a driving innovation mechanism or a business process re-engineering of an organization, right? So like Vidura said, in terms of economic structure, economic model, this whole carbon neutral story also finally ends up with the accountant, right? The accountant decides how many credits to buy and then offset and then looks at the profitability of the company. So so in my view, without innovation, whether it's carbon neutral or carbon negative or whatever you want to call it, is not going to solve the issue. But it's a very good tool to understand climate change in a corporate sense. That much I give credit.
Okay. On that note, before I go to Vidura, I just want to just remind our guests that we are in conversation with Chamit and Vidura about sustainability and if it's a myth or a reality, and we just touched on what it is, what sustainability is from an organization's point of view, and we are also talking about we were also talking about carbon neutral just briefly. And before we go to Vidura, I would like to invite the audience members. Please send us your questions and feedback and let us know how we are doing. And we have two fantastic guests here on our show, and do send us your question and we will bring it in, and my trusted co-host Afra will bring in the questions. So over to you, Vidura. Do you have anything to add? Your thoughts?
So I agree with you, Chaminda. I've also dabbled with carbon neutrality at some point, but that was also in the same way of understanding and integrating it into corporate thought. And there are many ways to integrate climate change into the corporate decision-making process. There's things like shadow carbon pricing, or climate change commitments. The mechanisms are there. The question is really about understanding what this is and understanding as an organization what is our role in terms of addressing climate change and global heating, right? What you see in the global business sector is there are various groupings that are coming together to address climate change. We had the business community coming together in 2011, I think, in Latin America during the climate change conversations. We have something called Science-Based Targets Initiative, where a lot of organizations pledged to certain carbon reduction targets. We have the UN Global Fashion Charter. So there are all kinds of gatherings that are coming together to collectively address climate change. Now, I wouldn't be very overly focused on carbon neutrality because, and it has become it has come to prominence in Sri Lanka partly because it's a feel-good story. The real question is that, are we addressing the fundamental problem? Is neutrality preceded by taking relevant actions? I mean, I don't particularly have a problem with offsetting, but the question I ask is that, have you done everything you need? Have you reinvented your business so that you don't need offsets? Is the question that you would first ask, right? So it's almost like a rush to paint yourself green in quite a lot of the point of view. But the challenge towards carbon neutrality shouldn't take our eye off the main point, which is radical, fundamental decarbonization. Okay, so let me give you some numbers game. If we are going to sit with the Paris Agreement targets on climate change, which I think is, even the targets themselves are insufficient in current scientific understanding. But even to get to the flawed targets, we have to reduce our absolute carbon emissions globally 4% year on year from this year onwards. Absolute. Okay, but we are nowhere close to even flatlining carbon emissions, and that applies to Sri Lanka as well. And I haven't seen many Sri Lankan organizations who have, important enough climate change related targets. So we've completely missed this whole idea around climate change. In not only in our corporate world, but also in our governance in the national, in the government. I mean, in the middle of the world moving to decarbonization and renewable energy, we have a utility talking about building more coal plants. So we are not even in the same planet in my book. Maybe we are in some satellite or somewhere. And this in a country which continuously comes up as one of the top 10 most vulnerable nations for climate change. So it's not that we are immune to this. It's not that we are such a landmass that if one place becomes unlivable, we can move to another area. If we just look at the next 50 years sea level rise projections and ask a simple question, how many of our major coastal communities will not get inundated? The answer is shocking. There's parts of Colombo will go under, parts of Jaffna will go under, Kalutara. So we have so many vulnerable communities along the coast. But this never factors into our decision making, whether it's in corporate or business. So we cannot live and we cannot talk about sustainability when that level of understanding is not there within the system.
Sure. That's an interesting point that you brought up, because I was actually going to ask you. I was going to throw in a question about law, because in England, Europe, they're generally speaking, like if you take privacy, if you take gender equality, if you take from an information technology point of view, the framework, the kind of regulations that come in, or the regulations rather, that what we see being enforced, to tech giants and so on, is quite stringent, sort of comparatively. In that sense, how are we doing in Sri Lanka, and what kind of an effect does that or our current situation have on our company? The reason being, I was just having a chat with Safra, a few days ago, and we were prepping for this chat, and then she spoke about the environmental impact assessment, right, and she was saying how companies kind of dodge around it, and are they? I mean, they are getting away with it, but then let me ask you two questions. Like, how can as organizations, how do we ensure that process happens smoothly, or is it purely on the government to regulate it and so on? So that's one part of the question. And the second part of the question is, if you are a large organization and where your primary product or service is, let's say, for example, fossil fuel, or it is a coal plant or something like that, what do you do? I mean, you can't close shop. You do employ thousands of employees, and then is there anything that you can do, being such an organization? So I know it's a bit of a heavy question. So
okay, so let me start. Let me start with the regulation part, and since you mentioned EU, let me say how it works. I'll give you a few examples on how it works in EU and what are the implications for countries like us. So EU had something called EU ETS, emissions trading scheme, for quite a long time, which forced companies to reduce their carbon emissions. Right. And carbon credits came into picture that Chaminda mentioned, but these were generally the credits that were traded inside EU. But what's happening now is quite interesting, because one of the COVID response mechanisms of EU is something called the EU Green New Deal. And one of the proposals that are currently on EU decision-making process is called CBA. Mechanism, which is carbon border adjustment mechanism. So what that does is, any product that is exported from another country to EU will be looked at from a carbon point of view, and if it has a high carbon intensity. The exact mechanism is not defined. If it's a high carbon intensity, is if the origination country is heavily coal or fossil fuel dependent, you will get a border tax, right? And there are companies, through because they're concerned about climate change, are actually putting targets regarding emission reduction on their supply chain, right? This is already happening in apparel industry. So you cannot operate in this is one of the good things in a globally connected world, which is supported by quite a lot of data and technology, is that we can measure all of these things, and those become key determinants in decision-making process, and this process is going to accelerate. So even if you're in Sri Lanka, even if there is no regulatory framework, if you are in a global business environment, you will be forced to adopt or give way to some other competitor in some other country. So if there's any corporate sector people who believe that this is a EU thing or some other country's thing. It's not going to work like that.
Oh,
now,
right.
on the EIA path, what is interesting is that our regulatory systems are fundamentally broken. And I say that with full responsibility. And we've seen this in the last few months, everything from sand to forest to whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And it's purposefully broken. It's not, it didn't break by accident, right? So there is there is a role that everybody has to play in this.
Sure.
The element that I want to bring in is that although we have a corporate persona, there is a larger role for all of us to play. That is the role of us individuals as a citizen, right? The reason why a lot of organizations are changing is not merely because the consumers or their customers are changing. In most countries, the organizations change because the employees demand change. And this is the piece that is not, and if you really think about how climate change becomes important, it is becoming important into the corporate agenda because of employees. So as an employee, we all have a voice. If the company is not addressing climate change, we all have a capacity to raise that voice and make that part of the organizational consideration. Okay, there's a role in HR, there's a role in finance, there's a role for everybody, right? So we need to think about these issues in a much more broader way. We cannot leave sustainability at the hands of anybody, whether it's environmental organizations, whether it's in the corporate CEO or the board. It's all of our role. And moment we embrace this new role of us as citizens, us as activists, us as corporate people, and when these things melt together, then we can have change.
Sure. And Chaminda, do you?
Yeah, so that's fantastic. Now, Vidura wears the hat of an activist as well, right? I am nowhere there. I am innovation. Why is to one thing I had to address what Safra asked. Why I kept Asia out is because of poverty. Right? If you don't have food on the table, what sustainability? What climate change? It's okay, we'll die anyway. Let us eat. Right? So Asia is just a followership part, and of course now China is leading a role, and of course thanks to learned gentlemen like Vidura and all that who are sticking in our country, we are sending the message through fast. But at large economies and large population, right? Asia has massive poverty, so they can't, you can't even comprehend the fact of innovation or research in this fact right now.
I beg to differ.
So, okay. So I beg to differ what Vidra says. So coming back to whether people are in carbon dominant corporates and then this happens and can we change? Of course we can change. Look at COVID, right? A lot of factories are making face masks. Is it for the love of the planet or for the profit? Right. So this is where I'm coming in the 3 C's. Right. Profitability is the issue. Human nature is to go profitable, but then you have exceptions as Vijura, you have exceptions as Greta Thunberg, you have exceptions as so many leaders who are voicing this fast because there's no time for innovation or research. We are going to get doomed, right? So the finer part is now we've sidetracked sustainability a little bit because Vidura and I are both passionate about climate change, right? So sustainability, we are talking about atmospheric sustainability, right? Then there's the hydrosphere, there's the lithosphere, there's the biosphere. When you look at the whole thing. So from a atmospheric point of view, Sri Lanka's contribution to control that next to nil, as per my perspective. But I completely agree with Vidura. The vulnerability is huge, and there are research shows that around the equator it's really tough. It's going to be the next few years. So what has to come to, for example, is the individual. I'm getting back to what's in it for me, CCC, right? If you look at what you throw out from your house, we don't have to go anywhere big here, and bring structures and regulators and all that. Just think about the stuff you buy from the supermarket and then you consume. Once you consume, you either pee or poop, right? That part goes off, and that is sustainable and that is biodegradable. Thank God for that. But what about the stuff that goes out of your house, from terms of bottles to wrappers to toothbrushes to combs to that is what we are talking about, right? So if that is what I am talking about from an innovation perspective, right? The basic example I always bring, and Safra has heard this more than 1,000 times, it's like the toothbrush, right? We can talk about corporate sustainability, but we brush our teeth with a toothbrush that doesn't degrade for 22 years. So what's the story?
Sorry, that's you. We brush with
I know.
brushes.
I also have started brushing. I don't have it at office, but it's 1,000 rupees a brush. It's coming from Vietnam.
It's
nice
not
one.
1,000 rupees. But Chaminda, can I just throw something on that?
Let me finish, and then you can
Sure.
come on. So what I push out is, for example, if you have LED bulbs in your house, is it for the love of the planet, or is it to reduce the electricity bill? So that's that mass adaptation I'm looking at. Through scientists and activists and all that, we found, at least to a certain extent, the LED bulb will help, right? Because you're giving comfort and convenience at a cheaper cost, and then lesser harm to the environment. But of course, it has its own issues, right? However, because it was invented, because it was innovated to your house, there is mass adaptation, but still there's a bit of a cost issue, right? So if you look at all what you throw from your house, right, that is industry to me, not the energy sector, because the energy, a certain component has gone to manufacture your home, right?
Right.
So it's all the same. It's basically the commodity and the product, right? So I am driving basically the innovation on the product front. And I've been doing a lot of work with schools. So I'm actually, what I do is I come and inspire. Otherwise, actually, it is doom and gloom for you and me. But if you drive the younger generation to doom and gloom, then we are all doom and gloom. So my perspective is there is a lot of hope, but the hope comes from profit, nothing else. Nobody will change. No regulator will change. No person will change. But like Vidura said, Europe has taken fantastic strides in the regulatory framework. But again, they play around with taxes, right? So the profitability comes in, like the GSP plus for us and things like that. So a carbon positive will have a higher tax. So there too, we are again addressing the profitability, right?
Right.
So the invention is there, the innovation part is being done, and I think if in my side, so you need activists and you need the other side. So I am on the other end of the stick, where we are pushing and inspiring the younger generation, the Z generation, to think out of the box and to create the daily consumables,
right,
the most sustainable manner. That's about it. Now, for example, for Sri Lanka, if you look at, like I said, from atmospheric perspective or a climate change perspective, we can't play around much. But the fertilizer we bring in, how it damages our hydrosphere. And then, of course, now there are supposed to be links to kidney problems and, all that. I don't know.
Okay.
There's no published research, but then that is a sustainable issue.
Right.
So that was addressed very well thanks to COVID, when we couldn't import fertilizer. People are going for compost and, all that kind of stuff. And they're talking about organic and all that. And stuff is grown, right? So those are in the sustainable point of view. And Sri Lanka, if you bring per se perspective,
right,
I think thanks to COVID, everybody is pushed to be self-sustainable. And thank God we have agricultural practice of 3,000 years that has that. And I hope corporates can inculcate that. But then yet again, the profit is playing in there, right? So if a regulator comes in there and gives a tax benefit, I'm sure the likes of all the top 10 companies in Sri Lanka will jump into, well, they've already jumped into agriculture, right? Many companies have, right? So if there's a tax benefit for organic growth, lesser fertilizer kind of thing, it just goes as wildfire, right? So, there too is again innovation. I mean, 3,000 years ago, there was a lot of innovation. Whereas that
Right.
simple, we call the muttier, right? You get the pot where you put a plant in and you bury the pot down under to conserve water and soil moisture, rather than just pouring water into the land where only 1% goes to the tree, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah,
to me, that too is innovation. Innovation is not rocket science and all playing around with electronics and all that. Innovation is how it comes to the consumer in the most what shall I say? The word organic is also abused, unfortunately, right?
Right.
So I would like to bring in a different perspective to say that the most closest natural ratios that the environment has, those elements in. As simple as that. For example, carbon to CO2, then the tree absorbs oxygen, and the carbon is coming to the bark of the tree, all that story. And it gets back to what it was, right? So the innovation is actually, I'm so inspired with all this happening. If you have you heard the term biomimicry, that is being adapted huge, right? So we are looking, finally we are looking into nature, how these systems work and this complex system work, and then we are bringing that into corporate success through profitable means, and that is innovation, right?
Absolutely.
So
And can we
that's the
and can
spin
we
I
hear
like.
Vidura's? Oh, sorry,
Sure.
Chaminda. We were saying?
So yeah,
Sorry.
so that's the spin that I want to bring in.
Okay.
Sometimes a little too late to change, huge corporate structures, but any corporate, I kid you not, and I'm sure all of us will agree, right? Corporate means a business at the end of the day. You got to pay your people. There has to be a bottom line and all that. So Asia mostly does trading,
Right.
but now there is manufacturing that is coming in. Vidura is smiling, so he's gonna hit my head because I'm
Asia,
getting out
no,
of it.
Chaminda, that is not correct, because Asia is the manufacturing hub of the world right now.
Right.
But
Let me just, that is basically a labor-centric strategy, right? So when I say trading is the in-country. Now you watch and see what will happen. The transformation, thanks to COVID, in the next 1 year in this country. Now that will be the self-sufficient innovation, right? The self-centric innovation. It's not just shifting offshore manufacturing and then coming in there. It's just I think we had this about 8 years back, right? Which had a self-sufficient system, and the British colonization was purely for that fact, because we had one of the highest diversity rates, right? So that's, so biomimicry is coming in, and things will be hopefully cheaper, so that all the corporates will jump in.
Sure. So let me.
Absolutely, I agree. So real quick, Vidura, if we can hear your thoughts really quick, and then we'll go for a few questions, because we are about 5 minutes over time. But Vidura, real quick, your rebuttal.
So you asked me about
point of view, and then Safra, I think we have some questions. So yeah.
Sure. You asked me about a coal company. There's no company called coal company. That's not a business. Your business is energy. How you determine how you're going to decide how you're going to provide energy is a choice. And while we talk about profitability is managed by multiple external factors. So and as much as Chaminda's innovation comes in, innovation relies on early adopters. And innovation relies on certain regulatory structures that enable innovation to happen. So these are not free market constructions. I don't necessarily buy on the Asia as a laggard on this, because if Asia becomes a laggard in this area, Asia will never always be a follower, and we don't want to be always followers, right? We were leaders once and we want to be leaders again. And if you are going to be leaders again, we need to think beyond what the other parts of the world is thinking. We cannot be behind them in their thinking. The only piece that I want to say is that as much as innovation is exciting, if you really look at how our work happens, we haven't got the adoption rates that we need, right? So I want to address something much more fundamental, and I would ask a very specific question. Reason we have all this social disruption and ecological destruction is because of a particular economic model. And I don't buy into an argument that privileging of profit and this economic model, we can tweak it around the edges and it will give us sustainability. So here, this is where there might be a slight disagreement between Chaminda and me, but that's my parting thoughts to you.
Thank you, Vidra. Safra, over to you. What do we have? What are the audience asking us?
So actually, one of the things that came up is while we've been talking a lot about corporates, we have a lot of young entrepreneurs who are social entrepreneurs. They're trying to create business with impact and change, but we don't have the legal systems here. There is no actual structure for a social enterprise. Getting funding for such an enterprise is extremely difficult. Since all of you have been part of this structure for numerous years, what advice would you give them?
In my take, again, I go back to the 3 C's, right? If there is a business model that shows profit, there is in number of people who wants to bump in money, whether it's sustainable or not, right? So that's the basic principle. So in that aspect, I agree with Viduro. The economic model tweaking out is not the solution for the world. But to me, since I have dealt with investors, since I have dealt with venture capital firms, since I have dealt with, all these kinds of guys, is that, at the end of the day, what's in it for me, right? So if there is an entrepreneur who has a brilliant idea, brilliant in the sense, unfortunately, when you're asking for cash, has to have ROI, right? Isn't that the issue? So however brilliant your idea is, if there's no ROI, whether it is unsustainable or sustainable, it won't be adapted, or you won't get the cash, or things like that. On the other hand, like Vidura mentioned about the regulatory frameworks coming in, and they are playing around with a little bit of stuff, and then we have triple reporting and things like that, right? Organizations are looking towards enhancing their triple reporting, right? People, profit, and planet. So entrepreneurs who are passionate on sustainability can actually hit at value adding corporate triple reporting, right? Because corporates are on the lookout for triple reporting ideas, right? So the people and planet. So entrepreneurs can upsell existing corporates with the ideas, even if you don't see an ROI there, right? In the context of sustainability and people, right? So I would say if people who are passionate about socio-economic benefits and planet and all that, work towards building a product or a system or a service or whatever that can enhance the triple reporting of a existing corporate. Other than that, stick to how you can make it profitable and drive innovation towards it.
Vidura, do you have any thoughts before we wrap up?
I would simply say I know how difficult it is to do social enterprise in Sri Lanka, and I agree with some of the comments that are raised. I think people go into social enterprises because there's a bigger passion, and most of social entrepreneurs I've met, for them profit isn't the only thing, and that's why they become social entrepreneurs rather than regular entrepreneurs. So and it's difficult, but I think that is the correct thing to do. So at some point you need to ask this question: as much as I have my C's, is this who am I as a person? Is this who am I in a world that is intrinsically connected, where value is more than what is measured in money? So I would hold on to that ideal, irrespective of whatever that comes my way. That's my take.
I think that's a nice way to end this segment. So Varun, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Safra. All right, so with that, I'm afraid we come to a close. to a very amazing and quite insightful and with a little bit of controversy sprinkled here and there, and we truly enjoyed this conversation. So once again, thank you very much to our guest, Vidura and Chamita. Thank you for being with us here today. It's been a pleasure. Do stay back online for a few minutes afterward, after our live session has ended. And a special thank you goes out to Safra, my co-host for today. Thank you so much. And finally, thank you to the Luminary team and to our audience who tuned in today and for the questions that you shared with us. Next week, we'll be speaking with the CEO of Incube, Graham Marshall, a motivational business speaker, and the acclaimed author, Steve Clark, and the senior marketing strategy leader and digital transformation expert, Monte Clark. And we'll be talking about, is there anything called ethical marketing? So don't forget to tune in next week. I'm Varun Chandramohan. Thank you for joining us today. See you next Saturday.